Oh, Sony, not a lot of people talk about you, do they? Despite the fact you're behind Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, Open Season, or Hotel Transylvania, not a lot of people know that Sony are the ones behind the animation process of these modern day classics. Yeah, one project that stands out above them all happens to be their Spider-Verse series of films, Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse, which is where they would debut a comic book-like inspired style that would later go on to ripple across the animation industry. But how did this style become so iconic, and how come DreamWorks drew inspiration from something that seemed so niche at the time? Join me, for today we're talking about Into the Spider-Verse and how it spawned an animation renaissance that will ripple across the industry during 2022 and far beyond. As everyone and their relatives 3 generation back knows, the original style for Into the Spider-Verse is inspired by a set of comic book series that gained popularity in America throughout the late 60s and all the way into the early 2000s. However, the original style was adopted from the Spider-Verse set of comics released by Dan Slott in 2014, which is relatively unique in the fact it was the first comic book based on a mainstream series to truly explore someone battling with alternate versions of themselves. According to those involved with writing and producing the film, they wished for the experience to feel as if someone had walked into a comic book, with the stylistic outlines, the free-frame quirks of a comic book transition to animation, as well as the somewhat quirky design of some of the characters in general. Not only that, the animation style itself pulled off some sneaky shading tricks to ensure your focus was drawn to specific things at certain times. With comic books mainly existing in 2D, the challenging task of bringing that 2D style into a 3D environment was set up for Sony's animation department, who, no doubt, have had much more experience than I ever will with comic books or freeze-frame animation. To further this, those behind the production of the movie employed artistic techniques that are reminiscent of comic books that originated 70 years ago to create an authentic experience, even if it came at the cost of significantly impacting the time it would take to put together the animation. A rather intriguing historical fact about the production of the first Into the Spider-Verse film was the fact it took almost 2 years for the animators to match the producer's vision, with Albert Mielgo lending a hand to establish the main style that the film would go on to be known for. At this point, this was more than just creating an animated 3D movie. It was clear from the very start that live-action animation wouldn't be able to appease the producers and their visions for this movie. It was clear that Sony needed to create an animation experience, not just another 3D film, which puts this film in a unique position. Gone are the days of needing to adhere to industry-leading standards, and in came a new style of animation that was more or less inspired by someone's vision, not the same generic style that had dominated the animation scene for quite some time. It was this importance and priority within the style of animating Into the Spider-Verse that sets it apart, considering it is a passion project conducted by some of the very best inside of Sony as well as inside of the Marvel team. I know those in the Marvel team get a lot of credit for the creation of this movie, and in a way they are responsible as a byproduct for those being the visionaries that are responsible for the long-term animation and the test animation expectations before things were put into intensive production. But it was Sony that managed to put together the majority of the animation behind the scenes to truly bring everything into existence and to fruition. This movie has to be the first time in a long time that we've seen a stylistic approach drawn in 3D and 2D, sometimes labelled a 2.5D world, compared to your aforementioned TV shows or previous movies that usually picked one or the other. The choice to pick both in this case while drawing inspiration from artists of the past and visions of the present set this movie apart and giving it a style that no doubt was unique enough to draw the attention of some of the titans of the animation industry. Compared to a lot of things being created with tweening sequences, lots of the animation that was poured into this film and its subsequent successor, although I'm not going to be spoiling that movie as it's less than a week old by the time I'm making this video, was created using handmade techniques and with stylistic flair that made comic books well. Comic books! This unique stance of picking a style that obviously struggled at the beginning of the conception phase, yet continuing to push over and over again, refusing to yield until their passions were fulfilled and perfection was achieved, is what makes this movie's animation so great, and that's just the start of it. It didn't take just making money as an answer, although money partially motivated the uniqueness, it was the artistic style that brought everything together. This level of personalization inside of a film was alien at the time of its release, and they made sure to take this further by emulating older style of animation known as motion smearing as opposed to motion blur to keep your attention whilst ensuring nothing is too jarring. That's one thing I need to mention, is the fact that everything amidst the stylization feels super smooth. There's a style of animation employed amidst the 24 frames per second animation that we usually see, and that's 12 frames of animation for slower parts or more stylistic parts of the animation. The fact that these transitions are super smooth and don't take away from your engagement too hard, balancing everything together, further enhances this movie's perfection. Not only that, halftone dots are employed as an effect to make everything feel more like a comic book. Another thing that assisted with this style and achieving that original style of it looking as if you stepped into a comic book was the fact they incorporated the rendering of 3D models in place with intermittent 2D effects. I knew 2D effects were used frequently, I mean just look at Spider-Ham, But the choice to pair everything together, especially the aforementioned 12 to 24 animation effect with both objects being 2D and 3D, that further enhances the richness of Into the Spider-Verse's personalization. They also used other techniques such as chromatic distortion, common with the ink brushing and drying that came with hand-drawing comic books, as well as using that 12 to 24 animation style to animate Peter Parker more smoothly to show his experience using his abilities, whilst Miles was animated at 12 to display his experience to the audience when swinging through the trees to escape Kingpin's forces. Not only that, there's also some creative symbolism involved near the end of the movie, as Miles can be seen jumping off a building, shattering the window underneath and turning it into shards of glass, yet the way the frame tilts to be upside down to show him rising. I don't know about you, but this is something I could truly get behind. I love the fact it feels like, even with such subtle symbolism, that it looks like as if he's rising up to face his responsibilities after dealing with his internal strife the whole movie, and it's just so wonderful to see. I think subtle touches like those are super neat. It's no wonder why Into the Spider-Verse's animation was thought of being revolutionary at the time and still is to this day. You would think I'm talking about ancient history here, but no, this is something happening in the now. This is something that happened 5 years ago. It's surprising that barely anyone's talking about the style of animation and how it's been slightly influential and hugely influential as of late, especially when inspiring DreamWorks and also Mitchell's vs. Machines. I know it was created by Sony, but it was still inspiring enough to spawn its own style. One more thing before moving into the next chapter of this ramble is the fact that usually animation has 12 principles and one of them has to be squash and stretch, which is where stiff objects remain static whilst those in motion are stretched and squashed to maximize animation efficiency, which results in some textures appearing off. The choice to substitute this with hand drawing the textures and simulating realism that goes beyond lazily stretching and squashing these textures whilst breaking one of the laws of animation was groundbreaking, considering it was demonstrated what you could truly do if you put enough time and effort into creating something personal and heartfelt. Speaking of which, I think it's time that we move on to our next chapter, which happens to be... Alright, I don't think I need to parrot the plot or anything, considering I'm under the assumption that most of you have watched Into the Spider-Verse, but let's talk about the writing behind Miles first, his failures, his family, and his eventual success alongside the rest of the spider people that emerge from the parallel universes opened up by the Collider. First of all, I like to point out how genius it was to have his father be an authority figure whilst also loathing Spider-Man to a degree. I know pretty much everyone knew Miles was going to become Spider-Man based on the trailers that released long ago, but it was that subtle hinting and foreshadowing that brought this adventure together right from the very beginning. Not only that, but it's shown that his father likes to use his authority to occasionally embarrass Miles with his own pride, as we can see within the intro of the movie where he's moving into prep school. As for Miles himself, he has to deal with the tragedy of being embarrassed at his school. Not only that, but almost everyone seems to be talking about him on his first day. Yet, his slightly witty side is shown later on when he interacts with a woman who will later reveal herself to be Spider-Gwen by cracking a joke about the theory of relativity. This not only shows Miles is pretty smart, but he's good at cracking jokes, albeit bad ones, and this stands out to Gwen considering she's someone who saw off making friends thanks to the fact she lost Peter Parker in her own dimension, who happened to be her best friend. Moving on, not too long after his first day needing to unwind, he goes to visit his uncle with a divine taste in music, if I must say so myself, in the hopes of unwinding. His uncle then subsequently takes him to a spot underground to do some graffiti to unwind, drawing a masterpiece depicting his battle with expectations, especially on his first day. This also demonstrates that Miles has an artistic background, and a stunning one at that considering what he's able to achieve as his uncle proudly watches on. One thing I'd like to mention is the theme of expectations here, even from the very beginning. I love the fact that this is foreshadowing what will come later on, especially when he's bitten by the radioactive spider. One extra thing I'd like to mention is the fact that his uncle is seen as forsaken compared to the authority figure that happens to be his dad. It creates a somewhat dysfunctional yet relatable family dynamic between everyone, whereas one was cast aside thanks to the fact they do things a little differently and a slight defiance of the law, whilst the other is the law to some degree. It's no doubt conflicting for Miles, who finds himself needing to appease both sides to some degree. The aforementioned pressure of expectations had been placed on his shoulders from the very beginning of his life, as it would seem, a boulder that would burden his shoulders for the rest of his journey during this film. Moving forward, Miles is soon bitten by a radioactive spider underground, and not gonna lie, the way he casually flicks off the spider is pretty funny to me. I guess it goes to show that Miles isn't afraid of spider, and no arachnophobia is gonna be deterring him or anything. I mean, he does idolize Spider-Man, so I can understand why he isn't really worried about any of that business. Unbeknownst to him, the spider he'd flicked off his wrist and his hand happened to be radioactive, or at least carried some gene-altering properties that most likely emerged from those experiments that were performed underground by the Kingpin. And soon enough, there would be more than one Spider-Man in this timeline that had been bitten by a gene-altering spider. Oh, did I mention the fact that in this timeline, Spider-Man or Peter Parker is blonde, has blue eyes, and is literally the embodiment of Prince Charming as a superhero, at least in Miles' dimension? It took me a moment to realize that sadly that's the only thing that's really revealed once Spider-Man battles with the Prowler, the Green Goblin, Kingpin amongst others, whilst Miles is watching as Spider-Man's tragically ended by Kingpin. Miles, upon witnessing the death of one of his idols, is respectively shocked but also feels like he can do something with the powers he's acquired from the radioactive spider. That doesn't come without a chase scene with the Prowler though. Speaking of the Prowler, I know I should try and keep everything in an orderly fashion, but man, the Prowler is such a menace, and in my opinion, his music always sends shivers down my spine and it's so sinister, not to mention his character design and outfit design. I love how his voice starts off as a mystery, but as time goes on, it starts to sound more and more like a familiar voice creeping up on Miles' ears. Okay, speaking of Miles, let's move back to him for a moment. Miles soon has to deal with his internal strife yet again, not only from the fact that he's made an embarrassment at school and this was something new, but now that his favourite idol has just passed away right before his eyes and he was sadly powerless to stop them. A tragedy that would fill Miles' mind, but sadly that isn't the only tragedy that takes place before his eyes. I'll come back to that in a little bit. The fact that this teenage boy has to deal with all these new emotions, suddenly inheriting the fact he's going to become the new Spider-Man one day if he ends up mastering his powers, the pressures of his academic life, he's even seen trying to quit at some point, but the headmistress outsmarts him because she points out the fact he was trying to get all the answers wrong on purpose to quit. This movie does a fantastic job of showing off the weight of expectations that clings to Miles' shoulders almost constantly, and it's unbelievable how well they managed to balance out this amount of tragedy with the victories that Miles endures near the end of the movie. Speaking of expectations though, Peter Parker, at least our version of Peter Parker, soon arrives inside of Miles' dimension whilst dealing with the artifacts of being from another, thanks to the fact that Collider opened up a portal to begin with for him to slip through. Although one Peter Parker promised to train Miles, this other one is literally dealing with his divorce, has a fear of raising a kid of his own, and is starting to lose himself under his own dread thanks to the fact his life is slowly but surely becoming meaningless as the days go by. There's this whole war of expectation for one mentor on the other, considering the blonde Peter Parker promised to train Miles whilst this other one shoots down the idea, especially because it's the same person. It really does go to subtly foreshadow the fact that these parallel universes have a true spectrum of randomness that they adhere to. The fact that the real or closest to real Spider-Man slipped through the portal is nothing more than the sheer breakthrough of luck, and this Peter Parker strife of dealing with children as well as the fact he's recently been divorced seems to be a running theme that mostly stands behind his motivations. Yet either way, he finds himself bonding with Miles and inevitably training him, albeit casually at the time. Speaking of training, I'm sure you remember the scene where Peter Parker and Miles swing through the small forest surrounding Kingpin's laboratory, where Peter's shown to have a smoother sense of direction than Miles. That same scene is when Spider-Gwen shows up to defend the pair of them from Kingpin, and that's that aforementioned foreshadowing that comes into fill in the story behind this movie once again, with Gwen being revealed to be the same girl that Miles joked with earlier in the film. I'm gonna have to break away from my structured rambling here just for a second to say that this foreshadowing is something worthy of a reward. This movie should honestly take the cake for it. Nothing's too in your face or obvious, it's all super subtle and delicate. Everything's been made with time, balance and compassion taken into consideration. I mean, dang, there's one thing I've been holding off on mentioning as it skips ahead, but I really need to talk about the Prowler and the foreshadowing behind him, plus another tragedy that further motivates and defines Miles. Upon all the spider people meeting and eventually heading to who I assume is Peter Parker's mother or grandmother's house. Sorry, I don't really know everything about the Spider-Verse. Anyways, they go to equip themselves. The house is suddenly laid siege soon after by some of Kingpin's forces, which is when Miles, already struggling to prove himself, tries to look for a way, at least to very least, to harness his abilities, considering he's still struggling with his internal strife. But nothing hits harder than the scene that comes before this. He goes to innocently visit his uncle, wishing for a place of comfort, and leaves a note, only to be tracked down by the Prowler beforehand, who is revealed to be his uncle. This further terrifies Miles, considering he's believed his uncle was out of town for a while and his uncle is actually the Prowler. It'll make him sort of think as to why his father's in such a position of authority now, that maybe something was happening behind the scenes that he didn't know about. Yeah, as if things couldn't get more tragic and terrifying, upon a ferocious battle inside that same household, the Prowler eventually chases down Miles, who happens to be wearing his budget Spider-Man suit at the time, only for Miles to barely slip up the mask and reveal to his very own uncle, the Prowler, that he's actually Miles, his nephew. This scene mixed with the Yanks really did shock my heart, and Marvel alongside Sony did an incredible job of showing the differences between Miles and his uncle, not to mention that Kingpin soon shoots the Prowler in the back for being unable to finish his job. I know that this chapter has a primary focus on Miles, and I will get to the antagonistic force of the Kingpin in just a moment, but following this, Miles seems to hit a dead end. Peter Parker, spotting him inside of his own dorm room after Miles had witnessed the death of his own uncle, subtly tells Miles to quit. Yet the voice of his father soon comes through the door, and Miles, being completely powerless powerless to answer it, considering he's been tied up by Peter Parker's spider web, has to bear the weight of these emotions, as well as knowing his dad will be leaving his side for a long time, that he won't be able to hug him or say a thank you as soon as he wished. The fact that in the grand scheme of things, Miles is completely powerless in this situation sparks up motivation for him to do something. I mean, his father did say he had a spark, and it's that spark that ends up shining through as Miles is able to use his newfound electricity-based powers to break free from the chair that Spider-Man had tied him to, inspiring him to create a new form of suit and to eventually pursue Kingpin's forces and to put an end to the Collider. Not only were the weight of expectations high for Miles, knowing full well that Spider-Man went through with this, he would perish in this dimension sooner or later, but also that being amplified by the appearance of other dimensional variations of Spider-Man, those expectations were almost crushing him at this point, considering he knew his uncle had been ended by Kingpin. His father was emotional about it still, and as he couldn't figure out how to take that leap of faith sooner or later, a lot of people would die and he would feel immeasurably guilty. Speaking of Kingpin and the Collider though, my goodness, I know Kingpin's meant to be the antagonist and the guy that you hate, but I can't help but feel a slight bit of sympathy for him, especially considering the fact that Dr. Octavius seems to be the one inside this movie that has ulterior motivations in one way or another. Sure, she may work for Kingpin, but she has a lot more power than just your regular scientist would have, and she probably was playing on Kingpin's motivations to further manipulate the Collider into bringing together parallel dimensions for her to hop into and to explore alongside potentially going on a dangerous rampage across them. I get that Kingpin may be a complete maniac and a sociopath, but the closest thing to him, his family, was lost by the very decision he had made to chase down Spider-Man, who I assume had been pursuing Kingpin for a long time, for the fact that Kingpin's business is extremely shady and most likely responsible for bringing terror to the city of New York to some extent. The fact that Kingpin lost the only thing that kept him going, his family, and that he wants them back, is something that slightly touches my heart, as I'm sure all of us have lost family before and some of us would like to bring them back, and that's what Kingpin was trying to do. Regardless of the consequences it may bring, he just wants his family back and he'd do anything to ensure it, even if it comes at the endangerment of others. Maybe his determination, passion and zeal is slightly misplaced, but that doesn't break away from the fact that Kingpin's tragic motivations mixed in with the various business dealings he conducted his entire life eventually led to this in the first place. He was and is a man unable to accept the consequence for anything he had done. He was a man who wanted everything done his way, and he was a man who was willing to do anything in his power to allow him to reverse those consequences and to bring everything back to the way it was. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with the Spider-Verse or the Spider-Man comic books, and I'm just speaking about this as an outsider who really loved the Into the Spider-Verse, but I believe Kingpin's story here is a mostly cinematic universe sort of deal, but that's my interpretation of it at the very least. The man admittedly did a lot of extremely bad things to the city at times, and even created a super weapon underneath the noses of everyone. Someone who brought fear to the city and also to his own family following the wishes to put an end to Spider-Man, a shallow motivation with an ender's pit of consequences to bear, and the Kingpin eventually bore those consequences at the end of the film as he was tied up by Miles and humiliated in front of everyone. This movie and its characters, in my opinion, happens to be a lesson of grave consequences, that parallel universes may sound beneficial, but in one way or another, that avoidance of consequence will eventually backfire as if it's the law of the universe to some degree. There will be Peter Parker's death in Miles' original dimension being reversed by the appearance of a new Peter Parker, all the way to Kingpin subsequently putting an end to countless others, including himself indirectly. Even the inclusion of cell destabilization if those who were sucked into the Collider's portals were to stay inside of this original dimension for too long was one huge consequence, and it also added to the fact that there was an urgency of time that was subtly stressed in the background, and it showed that Kingpin needed to be dealt with quickly and efficiently. This employment of a subtle sense of urgency that isn't stressed enough, countless tragedies that make the victory over Kingpin and Miles' rise to success as the new and reformed Spider-Man inside of this dimension even more satisfying. Even his own father suddenly having respect for Spider-Man after everything in his entire city has been through, and the hug share ended with Miles attempting to mask the fact he's Spider-Man with his own father. Oh man, this movie is just so bittersweet, marvelous, fantastically written and designed. It's an all-around masterpiece that I could never find an appropriate amount of words to sum up, but I can try. If I had to put it into words, it's truly one of a kind. This is how you write a set of wonderful and dynamic characters, how you animate captivating scenery and put in your own style, and how to set up a plot that screams of urgency without being over the top about it. And this is my best attempt to try and sum everything up, whilst also talking about the aspects of what makes the characters so great, as well as the urgency of their predicament that inspired them to keep pressing on, especially Miles. However, if we're to speak about inspiration, allow me to lead you into the third and final chapter, and that's how this masterpiece of a movie went on to inspire other industry-leading animators and artists to adopt this style of animation and storytelling in some way to their own stylized degree. One of the first examples of inspiration being drawn from Into the Spider-Verse was Sony's own The Mitchells vs. the Machines. I know this technically doesn't count as inspiring others, but I like to mention the fact that this is the first instance of the company that was responsible for inventing this style of animation to agree to adapt it into something that completely fits another movie. Into the Spider-Verse may have been based on comic books, but The Mitchells vs. the Machines felt like a nice balance between the two. The stylized animation that followed the scrappy artistic style of the movie that fits the main antagonist art style, Katie. It feels like this is the first film to truly be original about the style whilst also personalising it to a new extreme, to make you feel as if you were living in the shoes of Katie to an extent whilst the plot was pretty easy to follow along with. One more thing I'd like to point out about The Mitchells vs. the Machines is the fact that the family strife seems to be common denominator between it and Into the Spider-Verse, as in a sense Katie has to deal with the technological world that she loves, her interest in filming things as well as being a great movie producer, whilst her father is more traditionalist and doesn't embrace technology as well as the rest of the family. It sort of reminds you how Miles' father and his uncle are divided on the morality scale, whilst one is the pure force of reckoning, the other is a force of law, and the two often butt heads. Plus the fact that Miles, like Spider-Man, idolizes him whilst his father is hesitant to embrace Spider-Man to the very end, the same way Katie's father in The Mitchells vs. Machines is willing to embrace technology, considering the movie builds up this movement, is a massive point of influence. This stylized form of animation would go on to inspire other movie studios to do thereafter. DreamWorks were then releasing The Bad Guys. I would talk extensively about The Bad Guys, but I've already made a separate video on it, and if you would like to watch it, it would be in the title card so you can watch it whenever you wish, if you wish to watch it. But for simplicity's sake, they adapted this style of animation into a masterpiece that fit well with the heist genre that we were planning on making a huge difference in at the time of making The Bad Guys. The plots do not share many similarities at all, and it'd be folly of me to try and draw together small coincidences that pretty much all movies share, but the stylized animation style of The Bad Guys was subtle, with it being more present in the art style of itself and how it made it feel like you were exploring a comic book based around heists made in the past, with there primarily being a gold colour scheme that existed throughout most of the movie, like a backdrop, kind of like how there's a desaturated golden backdrop for a lot of heist themed comic books. DreamWorks made use of another thing partially borrowed from Sony, and that was the blending together of 2D elements with 3D elements, namely those inside some of the fight scenes or when characters were reacting to the predicament they were placed in. Bad Guys was a wonderful starting point for DreamWorks, but Puss in Boots to The Last Wish would go on to take the stylized influence up to the max to bring on the DreamWorks renaissance. The Last Wish followed an art style similar to Spanish action novels as well as Japanese anime and manga, while styling it up to 1000, with everything 2D or texturized having its own brush painted style, whilst there are colour spots between certain styles such as when Death draws blood from Puss and the sword drop is shown to switch from a deep deathly red to a dark and forsaken blue alongside the rest of the environment. DreamWorks also employs similar animation tricks to Sony, with the sleeping giant of Delamar being animated in 12 frames per second whilst Puss was animated in 24 frames per second to represent the balance of power and to give everything a much more fluid experience. They also employed the use of outlines and 2D objects, although they dialed it up much more in this movie, especially with some of the scenery itself, considering its colour palette was vibrant but also not blinding, a trait that was inherited from Into the Spider-Verse's balanced colour palette to some extent. One of the innovations that I think DreamWorks personally made to the style to make it even better was their use of colour coding into blending with the style. I know colour coding has existed as an art and as an animation technique for many years at this point, but to see it blend in with this style was something I'd never seen before, and I can only hope that other industry leaders put their own take on these films. Into the Spider-Verse showed the world and the animation industry that you can break the principles of animation while still creating something that would shock everyone. That you can also blend in your own artistic style. It doesn't have to be the same dull 3D movie. For the first time, Into the Spider-Verse showed the animation industry that can create much more than just a movie. It can also be an animation experience. Their choice to boldly stylize everything as if it were a comic book is a choice that shall resonate across the animation industry, and with some optimism, other giants would pick up on this style of animation and add it to their own movies as they see fit. I'm not saying that every movie should emulate the style of animation, considering it would become washed out relatively quickly, but I still think it's a style of animation that a majority of the industry could learn from and adapt to fit their own way without overusing it too much. I think stylized animation has a bright future, and I really wish that more industry leaders would adopt this style. It doesn't have to follow the whole schematic that Spider-Verse has led, but I think artists deserve more freedom in the animation industry, and I think this is a good start. Take the Super Mario Bros. Movie for example. This was your more traditional Illumination movie experience, but they stylized it in a way that Nintendo would, with the flames of the bullet bills taking more paper-esque shapes such as the original Paper Mario games that add to the experience even more. Sometimes it doesn't even have to fit the original theme of the whole movie. Sometimes it could just be really subtle and people can still appreciate it, as well as everything that has come thanks to this. Of course, I can't mention all of this without discussing Across the Spider-Verse. Unfortunately, I've only seen trailers of it and I haven't had a chance to watch it in theatres yet. Plus, it's too early for me to spoil clips of it online, so that's why it's rarely been mentioned. But from what I've heard, Sony have done an incredible and stellar job of improving the original style at debut within Into the Spider-Verse Spider-Verse, and the fact that they're making this a series has made me extremely happy considering my enjoyment of the first movie is undeniable. As a bit of an animation nerd myself, dating back to some of the first picture animation movies that Disney made and some other smaller industry leaders back in the early 1900s all the way to the innovations we made 100 years into the future, seeing this innovation, seeing how animation refuses to become dull is truly amazing, and it feels like we're approaching the zenith of animation with stylized movies and plot choices that feel a lot less into some movie idea and more like you're stepping into a new world. And I thank Sony out of all companies in collaboration with Marvel for innovating when creating an animation renaissance that no other company seemingly could. Anyways, I think that's all I've got to say about Into the Spider-Verse and the animation renaissance. It's truly amazing how a movie stylized like a comic book has done so much for the animation industry and will most likely do so for a long time, and it makes me a little bit giddy and excited inside knowing that the future of animation may never have a dull moment again, and this is coming from someone who doesn't even have a sole interest in superheroes. Thank you all for watching to the end, and I dearly appreciate your time. We've recently hit 25 subscribers and I could be more thankful for your appreciation. If you've got anything to share about this topic, feel free to drop it in the comments below. I read all of them, you know. I hope you all have a wonderful day. May the cosmos shine upon you and may you take care. Bye!